Hello again from Miss Ray and Maverick, who joined us this time. And we are going to talk about the Great Society, which everybody's been asking me about for like days. And now you're finally going to learn about it. So we're going to start before the Great Society, though, and we're going to talk about the guy right before the Great Society, which is going to be LBJ, which, if Bethany's watching, your favorite, we're going to talk about him a ton today. Now, before LBJ comes in, though, you have John F. Kennedy. And John F. Kennedy is going to come up with this new idea of basically this New Deal. What can we make a difference for in America and kind of improve what's going on? And his idea is what is called the New Frontier. So if you see this right here, we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of the 1960s, a frontier of unknown opportunities and perils, a frontier of unfulfilled hopes and threats. And so his new frontier is pretty much going to be an attempt to reform. It's a modern-day reform movement, a progressive era. Was not as impactful as LBJ's, but they have done essays in the past that are the difference between New Frontier and the Great Society. So, general overview of the New Frontier. In terms of the domestic policy, so here in America, we're going to begin to do reform movements for things like education, healthcare, and civil rights. He's also going to end sex discrimination. Now, this isn't saying that there was still not sex discrimination. However, they actually passed a law, and actually, that's supposed to say 1963 Equal Pay Act. My fault. But anyways, basically it says that you cannot pay a male more than a female. So it's going to give equality for in the workplace without sex discrimination. Additionally, he's going to fund a lot of mental health programs. Part of this was because his sister had a severe amount of mental health issues, as well as some of the family members. And so he's going to create mental health programs and research programs. He's also going to increase NASA, which makes sense. We're in the middle of the space race. Massive increase for NASA, and additionally a large tax cut to help America. Now, the reality is that the New Frontier was not perfect, and it wasn't really a success. A lot of his acts took a long time to get through Congress, and additionally, because it took so long to get through Congress, by the time Kennedy dies, it's not that successful. He passes laws, but he was only there for a few years, so it's not as successful as it could have been. Which brings us to a guy named LBJ, so Lyndon B. Johnson. Now, Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society is a double star, very important term. Basically, it's going to be his modern-day progressive era, and it really is a new progressive era. I think an essay on Great Society versus progressive era would be awesome. Now, LBJ is going to have several different reform movements that he's going to do. So we're on those notes that are the stapled notes. It did not have any connect the dots, sorry, but I hope you can figure it out. So we're going to start with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Basically, this is going to provide federal aid to public schools, especially with textbooks and libraries. Now, this ends up being the very first time that we had any federal funding for below the college level at the public schools, and that was a huge deal. Now, why was this needed? Well, 1/4 of all American families were under the poverty line. And because they were so under the poverty line, people didn't have enough money for schools and didn't have very high quality schools. And so what happened is, additionally, all these unskilled labor positions following World War II are going to be taken up. And so they're becoming missing and more rare. Now what happens is that because of this, the education is going to suffer. And basically, if you don't have an education, well, you're not going to have a job. So we need an increase of education and the quality of education. Now, LBJ said that education was the key to really unlocking a true great society. So education is the foundation of everything going on in America. Now, how did this help, especially the parochial schools as well as public schools? Gave them new textbooks as well as library materials. Which brings us to Medicare versus Medicaid. Now, these are very important terms, and they affect you even today. So it's kind of important that you know what these terms are. So let's start with Medicare. Now, Medicare is specifically for the elderly. I think of it, the easiest way to remember it is care. Caring for the elderly, caring for your grandparents. Now, this helps people over the age of 65 afford health care. Now, there's several different plans that you can be able to choose. You can choose just for hospital, inpatient, outpatient care. You can add in the ability to have medication. It's all up to you, and you do have to be 65, and you have to qualify. So, for example, if you're making millions of dollars, you're not going to qualify for Medicare. It's in order to help those who really need it. Now, Medicare has rapidly increased. A lot more people are using it than they used to. A lot of people used to have private insurances. People nowadays are expanding that into Medicare. On the other side, you have Medicaid. Medicaid is for the poor. Medicaid can also be for the poor who have somebody who's disabled. For example, a poor family who has somebody with schizophrenia. This would be able to help them. Now, it does differ from state to state, which is different from Medicare. Medicaid is very different depending on the state. If you're in more of a Republican state, Republican states are going to have a lot less Medicaid spending because it's a very democratic ideal. It's the Obamacare. So when you look into things like California and things like that, that's why you get those. In addition, it's poverty. The more poverty, the more likely you are to be able to spend money on having an expansion of Medicaid in that state. Now, who does this really affect? You can see from this image that a lot of America is affected by Medicaid. So, for example, 45% of all the births are paid for by Medicaid. 39% of children are covered by Medicaid. Adults with HIV and nursing home residents are also going to have a major impact from the Medicaid legislation. Now, at the same time, though, the idea is that in theory, when you have the Affordable Care Act, so Obamacare, the idea was that it would be able to cover more people. So you have Medicaid eligibility, but you also have people who aren't under that umbrella. So basically people who are just over that poverty line. Well, some of the concerns, for instance, in Utah is that if we didn't provide a gap, which is you have to come up with that basically by the state. If you don't have a gap, you see this image right here that you have some people who can afford afford insurance, some people who can only afford Medicaid, and some people who don't qualify at all, who are in this really weird middle gap place that is basically you're not poor enough to have Medicaid, but you're not rich enough to pay for your own insurance. And this gap insurance has become important, especially in the last couple of years, as you can see in Utah. Now, why was this so needed? Well, half of the elderly and seniors had no health care. And so this propels you into more and more poverty as well as having multiple health issues. So this is going to solve all those problems and allow you to be able to, as an elderly person, have medical care. Now, how did the amount of elderly people under the poverty line change? 1 in 3. I'm assuming this is saying elderly people. Well, I can't see it because my picture is there, but it's 1 in 3. I did this the other day. How does Medicare differ from Medicaid? Medicare is specific for the elderly, while Medicaid is specific for the poor, and additionally, you can get assistance for that if you're elderly as well. Now, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, basically this is going to help the poverty level by providing you affordable housing. Now, affordable housing is a lot more prevalent than you think. Basically what happens is you're given a subsidy. Based on your income as well as your debt, you are able to get varying funding. So some people living in this housing development, as you can see right here, will only pay $400 per month in rent, while others will pay maybe $900 to $1,000. It all depends on your specific income. Now, affordable housing is all throughout every single state. And a lot of times you can't even tell. Back in the day, you could tell when it was affordable care and affordable housing. But nowadays, it could be anything. I remember at my last apartment complex, we lived right next to a bunch of affordable houses, and they looked exactly the same. You really can't tell, but the people living there do need help and need these government subsidies. Now, Robert Weaver of the Department of Housing and Urban Development is going to be the very first African-American cabinet member in American history. So not only is LBJ advocating for reduced and subsidized housing, you're also going to have the very first African-American there. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that African-Americans traditionally do tend to be in more poverty, therefore are more likely to use the urban development projects, which that's Robert Weaver right there. So one cause of the housing issue and the housing crisis, businesses began to leave the city centers due to suburbanization, and this creates massive urban rioting, especially for people who lost their jobs, which is why people needed affordable housing. Now, how did they help low-income families? They allowed them to be able to pay for private housing. That's through government subsidies. They also provided general aid and also assisted in the creation of new housing developments, especially for low income. And again, how did they break the color barrier? with the first African American cabinet member, as well as assisting people in poverty to be able to get affordable housing. Now, immigration. So now what LBJ is going to do is he's going to allow immigrants to be able to come to America. Now, before we had the quota system, which remember, Red Scare, that's historical context, we limited immigration from certain countries. Now we're going to ban that. Basically says you cannot limit based solely on where that person is coming from. And they really put the emphasis on family reunification, as in Americans reuniting with their family throughout the world. Now, LBJ is going to sign this actually at Ellis Island, which really kind of shows the emphasis of the immigrant. Now, in terms of what happens to our immigration, this skyrockets. We send into another immigrant era that has lasted even up until today. Now, immigration from America is mostly going to come from Latin America. So this is where we get the Ranchero program, massive Latino immigration into America, and that continues, that right-hand column is going to continue even up until today. Now, how did discrimination get impacted? It was those quota systems that we talked about. So that's that historical context. Priority for immigration was families attempting to reunify and come back together. Two major immigrant groups that are going to skyrocket is Latin American and Asian descent, which if you have any family members that have come within the 1960s and 70s of that nationality, that's part of the reason why. Now, two more really quickly. These are going to be more environmental. So Silent Spring is going to be a book, and this book is going to bring awareness to pesticides and environmental issues throughout America. Basically, what she talks about is that when we do this crop dusting and spray pesticides, it's actually killing the planet, it's killing plant life, it's killing animals. And so basically what she's going to advocate for is the reduction of pesticide, and this works. Our pesticide levels are actually going to go down and not be as concentrated as they were before. Now, also, additionally, this took away spraying it on people, which is how they used to get rid of mass amounts of disease throughout America. And overall things that this ended up achieving, the Water Quality Act, people have to clean up rivers, including the states. Brought back America's heritage and really preserved. It was very John Muir type. And then the environmental movement in America begins with like the tree huggers and things like that. We did that. Okay, last one is unsafe at any speed. Basically, what this is going to do is it's going to criticize the U.S. automobile industry for ignoring the safety concerns. For instance, back when my dad was a kid in the 60s, he got into a really bad truck accident. They had 10 people in the truck, and nobody had a seatbelt. They're going to stop that with unsafe at any speed. Basically, it's going to say, why has the automobile industry been ignoring these safety concerns? Now, what happens is that this book is going to bring awareness. Basically, it's saying things like the automobile industry is cutting corners, using cheap rubber in order to save money. And because of this, we're going to have our very first real legislation for safety in cars. So, as Congress is going to establish safety standards for automobiles and tires, this is why you have to get checkups, emissions, seatbelts, things like that. And how this still affects us today is that we continue to have more consumer protections, such as the Wholesome Meat Act, which now allows you to be able to have labels of what is in your food. So hopefully this explains the Great Society. Basically, it's a modern-day progressive movement. You have the progressive eras of immigration, housing, Medicare, Medicaid, books such as Silent Spring and Unsafe at Any Speed. Pretty much it's this progressive era that's only going to last about 6 years. So hopefully you learned something today.